Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We all know the cinematic version of this story. A few brave Greeks fought off endless hordes of Persian invaders to save Western democracy. But, what if the ultimate outcome of these legendary wars actually featured a Persian king sitting safely in his palace, dictating terms of surrender to a completely subjugated Greece without risking a single soldier?
Right, completely flips the narrative we have been taught.
Yeah.
And that narrative is usually heavily curated by Greek historians who were, quite frankly, writing for a Greek audience.
Yeah.
So if you step back and look at the actual administrative records or the economic constraints and the geopolitical realities of the Achaemenid Empire, the story changes entirely.
It really does. So we are looking at a time frame spanning roughly 500 to 449 BCE. And for this deep dive, we are bypassing the standard military play-by-plays.
Exactly.
We are not going to focus on who held which line on a battlefield or, the specific thrust of a hoplite spear.
No, we are here to uncover the profound political, economic, and ideological machinery behind the conflict.
Right. This is an exploration into how ancient logistics, taxation, and propaganda shaped the narrative that we still fundamentally rely on today when we talk about East versus West.
And to do that properly, we have to recognize a massive historical blind spot. We rely heavily on Herodotus and Thucydides, who were brilliant, but they were not objective observers.
They definitely had a bias.
Yeah, they were deeply invested in portraying Greek resilience. When we shift our focus to the surviving traces of Persian administration, we stop seeing a simple moral fable of freedom versus tyranny.
Right.
Instead, we see a complex, protracted collision of two fundamentally incompatible systems of governance.
I want to start by looking at a diplomatic disaster. To understand how this machinery ground into motion, we actually have to back up before the famous battles, before Marathon or Salamis.
Yes, the initial contact.
Right. We need to look at the very first contact between Athens and the Persian Empire. This is the incident of earth and water occurring around 507 BCE. Let us set the stage in Athens. The city had just recently expelled its tyrant, a man named Hippias, around 510 BCE. Shortly after, a statesman named Cleisthenes instituted these radical early democratic reforms around 508 or 507 BCE.
And those democratic reforms were incredibly fragile. The Athenians had just completely restructured their political system.
Breaking the power of the old aristocratic families. Right?
Exactly, by organizing the citizenry into new voting tribes based on geography rather than bloodlines.
Yeah.
It was a massive civic upheaval.
And their neighbors were not happy about it. The Athenians were terrified of a Spartan intervention. Sparta was an oligarchy, and their king, Cleomenes I, wanted to march in.
Right, he wanted to crush this new democratic experiment.
And restore a friendly oligarchic rule in Athens. So Athens is politically isolated, militarily vulnerable, and staring down the most lethal land army in Greece. So they look east for a lifeline. They send envoys across the agency to Sardis.
And Sardis is crucial here. It was the regional Persian capital in Lydia, which is in modern-day Western Turkey.
Right.
It was a seat of immense imperial power. The Athenian envoys arrive seeking a defensive alliance with the Achaemenid Empire. They want Persian protection to deter Sparta.
They secure a meeting with a man named Artaphernes. He is the satrap, or regional governor, of Lydia. More importantly, he is the brother to the Persian king, Darius I.
He is not a minor official.
No, this is a man who speaks with the authority of the great king. The envoys present their case for an alliance. Artaphernes listens, essentially asks who these people even are, and then stipulates the Persian terms for a treaty.
He demands tokens of submission, the traditional earth and water, along with a requirement for an annual tribute.
What kind of tribute are we talking about?
Well, the historical records indicate this tribute was initially assessed at 10 talents of silver, though some accounts suggest Darius later increased it to 450 talents.
A talent of silver is roughly 57 pounds of precious metal. So 10 talents is a substantial sum for a fledgling city-state.
It is.
But 450 is an economic breaking point. But here's the wild part. The Athenian envoys, staring down the barrel of a Spartan invasion, actually agree to the terms. They offer the earth and water. They seal the deal.
They offer the tokens, yes.
Yeah.
But the real friction happens when they return home.
Right. The envoys travel back to Athens, and they present this finalized deal to the newly formed, fiercely independent Athenian assembly. And the assembly goes completely ballistic.
They reject the treaty entirely.
They view it as total subjugation. I was thinking about how to frame this, and the best way to understand the diplomatic disconnect is through a modern business lens.
Okay, let's hear it.
It is as if a group of junior executives from a tiny tech startup go to a massive multinational conglomerate to sign a basic non-disclosure agreement.
Right.
But because they don't understand the corporate legal jargon they are walking into, they accidentally sign a contract that hands over total equity and ownership of their entire startup to the conglomerate.
Yeah, they missed the fine print.
Exactly. They fly back, walk into the boardroom and say, "We got the partnership." And the board looks at the paperwork and realizes they just sold the company for a handshake.
That analogy hits exactly on the mechanics of the misunderstanding. We have to understand the fundamental clash of worldviews happening in that audience chamber in Sardis.
It wasn't just a language barrier.
Not at all. For the Achaemenid Empire, there was no such concept as a mutual defense pact or a treaty of equality with a peripheral minor state that simply did not exist in their diplomatic vocabulary.
It wasn't an alliance, it was an absorption.
Exactly. The Persian ideology maintained that the great king held universal supremacy. He possessed a divine mandate, bestowed directly by the supreme god Ahura Mazda,
You rule everything.
to ensure stability, order, and truth in all regions, stretching to the very edges of the known world.
And from a Persian map's perspective, Athens was essentially at the absolute edge of the world, just a rocky peninsula jutting into the sea.
A very distant, very poor frontier. To truly grasp the Persian perspective, we need to examine the Behistun inscription, which Darius I commissioned around 520 BCE.
Where is that located?
This is a massive rock relief carved into a cliff face along an ancient road in modern Iran. It is physically positioned hundreds of feet above the ground, making it largely unreadable to people walking by.
Which tells us what?
It tells us it was meant as a proclamation to the gods as much as to men.
So what does the inscription actually say?
It details how Darius violently put down a series of rebellions across the empire when he took the throne. Rebellions in Persis, Elam, Media, Babylonia, and Armenia.
Just putting down revolts left and right.
Yeah, but it's not just a military brag sheet. It introduces the profound Persian ideological concept of draga, which roughly translates to the lie.
The lie. So rebellion wasn't just treason, it was a falsehood.
It was a cosmic disruption. In the Achaemenid worldview, rebellion, or even mere defiance of the king's terms, was not viewed simply as a political maneuver.
It was deeper than that.
It was a severance from rightful obedience to the king, who was the mortal instrument of divine order. To rebel was to embrace chaos and falsehood.
I see.
So when those Athenian envoys offered earth and water to Artaphernes, in the meticulously kept ledgers of the Persian administrative and ideological system, Athens had formally entered the empire as subjects. They had acknowledged the divine order.
So when the Athenian assembly rejects the terms weeks later, they think they are just backing out of a bad trade deal. But in Sardis and in the capital of Susa, that rejection is logged as an act of rebellion.
It was treason. It was draga. Athens had embraced the lie.
This sets an incredibly dangerous stage. From the very first handshake, the two sides are operating in completely different, totally incompatible realities.
Absolutely.
And this initial diplomatic friction does not just vanish into the archives, it simmers, and it eventually ignites into physical violence on the fringes of the Persian Empire. This takes us into the Ionian Revolt and the burning of Sardis, spanning from 499 to 493 BCE.
We have to shift our geographic focus slightly east across the Aegean, back to the Ionian city-states, situated on the western coast of Asia Minor.
Places like Ephesus and Miletus.
Yes, these were wealthy, culturally Greek cities. But they had been subjugated by the Persian Empire decades earlier, back in 546 BCE, during the conquests of Cyrus the Great.
Culturally Greek, but paying taxes to a Persian king. And they were profoundly unhappy about the arrangement. We are talking about heavy financial burdens, military conscription where Greek hoplites were forced to fight in Persian campaigns.
And most importantly, they were ruled by local tyrants who were propped up by Persian gold and military backing.
Right.
The Persian administrative model relied on finding a compliant local strongman, making him a tyrant, and holding him responsible for delivering the taxes and keeping the peace.
It's basically outsourcing the governance.
It was efficient for the empire, but deeply resented by the Greek citizenry. The situation finally comes to a head with one of these specific tyrants, Aristagoras of Miletus.
Aristagoras is such a fascinating, self-serving figure in this narrative. He is the Persian-backed tyrant of Miletus, and he organizes a military expedition against the wealthy island of Naxos, promising his Persian superiors a massive return on investment.
Which does not pan out.
The expedition is an absolute disaster. They fail to take the island, they burn through the funding, and Aristagoras realizes he is in deep trouble.
He is facing severe punishment, likely execution or removal by the regional satrap for wasting imperial resources. Aristagoras calculates that his only chance of survival is to incite a full-scale rebellion before the Persians come for him.
Just a desperate, purely pragmatic move.
Exactly. He publicly renounces his own tyranny, declares that Miletus is now a democracy, and uses that ideological fervor to trigger similar revolt across the entire coastal regions of Ionia, Aeolus, and Doris.
He flips the political script to save his own skin, and suddenly the entire coast is on fire. But Aristagoras is smart enough to know that a collection of coastal cities cannot fight the Achaemenid Empire in a protracted war.
No, they don't have the numbers.
Right. He needs heavy infantry, he needs a navy, so he travels to mainland Greece to beg for help. He goes to Sparta first, and they basically laugh him out of the room. Sparta has zero interest in fighting a land war in Asia, but then he goes to Athens.
And Athens remembers that lingering threat from the Persian court. They know their rejection of the Earth and Water Treaty means they are already viewed as rebellious subjects by the great king.
Right.
So Athens, perhaps thinking it's better to fight the Persians in Asia than wait for them to arrive in Attica, agrees to help.
Athens, along with the nearby city of Eretria, sends a force of 20 triremes across the Aegean. 20 ships might not sound like a world-conquering armada, but it was a significant commitment of men and resources.
Very significant for them at the time.
This allied Greek force lands, marches inland, and in 498 BCE, they actually managed to capture and burn the lower city of Sardis. That is the very regional capital where the earth and water misunderstanding took place.
The burning of Sardis is a pivotal psychological and political event. But we must analyze the Persian reaction carefully. It is very easy to assume the Persians saw this and immediately decided to conquer the world.
But they didn't.
They did not. Darius I did not view the burning of Sardis as an existential threat to the survival of his empire. He viewed it as a treasonous betrayal that necessitated tissue.
Tissue.
Yes, a specific Persian concept of righteous retribution.
Herodotus provides a very vivid, almost cinematic vignette about this moment. He claims that when Darius was informed that the Athenians had burned Sardis, he asked who the Athenians even were.
Right, emphasizing their insignificance.
Yeah. Then he took his bow, shot an arrow high into the sky, and prayed to Ahura Mazda for vengeance. And to ensure he never forgot, he ordered one of his servants to repeat the phrase, "Master, remember the Athenians," 3 times before dinner every single day.
It is a striking image, but it highlights exactly why we have to look past the Greek dramatization. The servant whispering at dinner makes it sound like an obsessive, all-consuming vendetta.
Like a personal grudge.
Exactly. But how did the Persians actually respond on the ground? They responded with cold, methodical, administrative pacing. This was a peripheral frontier conflict to them. Darius did not immediately draft his entire royal army and march on Athens.
Right. He treats it like a border dispute that needs a policing action.
He dispatched his generals to systematically reconquer the rebellious territories one by one. They retook the island of Cyprus by 496 BCE. They secured the crucial straits of the Hellespont. They took their time building up a fleet.
Just very systematic.
Very. And eventually they besieged and sacked Miletus in 494 BCE, completely crushing the last remnants of the revolt by 493. But what happens after the violence is what is truly significant.
This is the part that usually gets glossed over. The Persians win, they crush the rebellion, but they do not just burn everything to the ground and enslave everyone.
No, the Persian commander Mardonius actually instituted a wave of political reforms. He deposed several of the local tyrants in Ionia, the very men the Persians used to rely on.
And then what did he replace them with?
He allowed democratic factions to take power in those cities.
Wait, really? The absolute monarchy of the Persian Empire forcibly instituted democracies in their own subjugated territories. That seems entirely contradictory to everything we just established about the great king's divine mandate and absolute rule.
It feels contradictory until you look at it through the lens of imperial economics and pragmatism.
Okay, lay that out for me.
The Achaemenid administration realized that the tyrants they had sponsored were the primary source of the friction. The tyrants were causing unrest, which interrupted the flow of taxes.
Ah, so it comes down to the money.
Always. By allowing democracies to form, the Persians removed the immediate grievance, pacified the local populations, and most importantly, ensured that the tribute started flowing back to Susa without requiring a permanent, expensive military occupation.
They cared about loyalty, order, and revenue far more than they cared about micromanaging the civic structures of a peripheral province. So they clean up the mess in Ionia, they get the taxes flowing again, but the servant is still whispering, "Master, remember the Athenians," before every dinner. The Ionian Revolt is crushed, but the retribution against the mainland, against Athens and Eretria, has not yet happened. How does an empire actually mobilize for retribution across a sea?
The logistics of this retribution are staggering. The first phase begins in 492 BCE. Mardonius leads a combined land and naval expedition to secure the northern approaches to Greece.
Going the long way around the Aegean.
Right. He moves his army through Thrace and Macedon, ensuring those regions are fully subjugated vassal states to protect his supply lines. However, a significant portion of his fleet is destroyed in the severe storm near Mount Athos, which temporarily halts the advance.
The weather buys the Greeks some time, but 2 years later, in 490 BCE, Darius tries again. He sends a specialized naval task force commanded by Datis and Artaphernes. They island hop directly across the Aegean.
Direct assault this time.
Yeah. They burn Naxos. They besiege and enslave Eretria, fulfilling half of their retributive mandate. And finally, they land their forces in Attica at the Bay of Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens.
Which leads to the famous Battle of Marathon, where the Athenian hoplites, along with a small contingent from the city of Plataea, manage a highly decisive tactical victory.
Against pretty steep odds.
Yes. They manage to envelop the Persian lines, forcing the expeditionary force to break, run for their ships, and sail back to Asia.
And usually this is where the story focuses intensely on the weight of the hoplite shield and the tactics of the phalanx at Marathon. But again, we are looking at the underlying structures.
Right.
After Marathon, the Persians don't just give up. There is a 10-year interbellum. Darius dies in 486 BCE, and his son, Xerxes I, inherits the throne, the empire, and the mandate for retribution.
And Xerxes doesn't mess around.
No. He spends years preparing a second, vastly larger invasion force. In 480 BCE, he marches this army to the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. And he crosses it by constructing 2 massive pontoon bridges.
We have to pause and consider the engineering and logistical reality of those pontoon bridges. They were constructed by lashing hundreds of ships together, laying down massive cables made of flax and papyrus, and building a timber road over the decks.
A road over the sea.
Literally. Complete with earthen walls so the animals wouldn't panic at the sight of the water, it required thousands of specialized workers, massive stockpiles of timber and rope, and immense logistical coordination just to get the army onto the European continent.
I am looking at the numbers the ancient sources claim for this invasion, and I just don't buy it. Herodotus writes that Xerxes' army numbered in the millions. He specifically cites a figure of 2.6 million personnel present at the later Battle of Thermopylae.
Which is, frankly, absurd.
Right. If you try to visualize 2.5 million men, plus their horses, their baggage trains, and their camp followers, moving through ancient, unpaved mountain passes, it breaks your brain. It is physically impossible.
It is entirely impossible, and modern scholarship rigorously rejects those ancient claims. We have to apply logistical analysis to history, a method pioneered by historians like Hans Delbruck.
Okay, Delbruck.
Delbruck argued that you cannot just accept ancient numbers. You have to calculate the carrying capacity of the land.
Explain how that calculation works. How do we shrink 2 million down to reality?
You calculate the volume of water required per man and per horse per day. You calculate the agricultural yield of the territories in Thrace and Macedon that they were marching through. You calculate the speed of a wagon train on a dirt road.
So you run the actual math on survival.
Exactly. When you run the math, estimates must be drastically reduced. Delbruck and contemporary scholars limit the estimates of Xerxes' land forces to a maximum of 100,000 to 200,000 combatants, supported by a fleet of perhaps 600 to 1,200 triremes.
Which is still massive for the ancient world.
Oh, definitely. But an army of 2 million men would have consumed all the available fresh water in northern Greece in a matter of days. They would have starved to death long before they ever reached a battlefield.
But even with those massively reduced numbers, an army of 100,000 or 200,000 in antiquity isn't just an army. It's a moving, migrating city. You can't just tell 100,000 guys to forage for berries. They must have been hemorrhaging state capital to pull this off. How did the Achaemenid Empire actually fund this deployment?
War is extraordinarily expensive, and we recently found compelling physical evidence of exactly how the Persians managed their cash flow. A 2024 archaeological discovery in the ancient city of Notion, located in western Turkey, provides a perfect illustration.
What do they find?
Archaeologists uncovered a buried hoard of over 100 Persian gold coins, known as darics. Based on the surrounding stratigraphy, they were likely buried around 500 to 480 BCE, right in the buildup to this invasion.
What does a buried pot of gold coins on the coast of Turkey tell us about Xerxes marching into Greece?
It tells us about the mechanics of their financial strategy. A single gold daric represented approximately 1 month's pay for a mercenary soldier. Finding a hoard of this specific size in a peripheral staging region during this exact time frame strongly suggests that the Achaemenid administration was stockpiling and distributing vast amounts of hard currency.
They were just pouring cash into the region.
Yes, they were minting gold specifically to hire Greek and Anatolian mercenaries, to pay cash for local supplies along the route, and to fund the rapid construction of ships. This is physical proof that this invasion was not just a movement of troops, it was a massive deployment of state capital. The Persians were buying their way into Europe as much as they were fighting their way in.
So Xerxes is marching this heavily funded, well-supplied army of perhaps 200,000 men down through the Greek peninsula. And this leads us to August of 480 BCE and the most famous bottleneck in military history, the Battle of Thermopylae.
The hot gates.
Now, I want to challenge the popular narrative here because the cinematic version of this event has completely overwritten the historical strategy. We are always told about the 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, making a conscious, glorious suicide mission to buy time for the rest of Greece to assemble.
Which is a very romantic notion.
But when you look at the troop deployments, that romanticized myth of intentional sacrifice starts to look incredibly shaky.
It requires a severe reality check. The Greek strategy was absolutely not based on intentional sacrifice. It was a carefully calculated, highly pragmatic, dual-pronged blockade devised largely by the brilliant Athenian politician and naval commander Themistocles.
Okay, so what was the actual plan?
The geographic reality is that Thermopylae was a narrow landpass between the mountains and the sea. The plan was to hold that narrow landpass, where the massive Persian numerical advantage would count for less, while simultaneously blocking the adjacent sea straits at a place called Artemisium with the combined allied Greek fleet.
I was looking at the numbers for the Artemisium fleet, and it completely shattered my understanding of this entire campaign. The Greeks committed around 270 triremes to Artemisium. A trireme requires about 200 men to row and fight.
Right.
That means the fleet at Artemisium was manned by approximately 50 to 70,000 men. Why on earth would the Greeks commit a force that massive to tens of thousands of their citizens to a naval blockade if Leonidas was just staging a brief theatrical suicide delay on land? You don't risk your entire naval capacity for a 3-day speed bump.
Exactly, you don't. The deployment numbers prove the intent. Leonidas and the Greek high command honestly believed that the pass at Thermopylae was impregnable if properly garrisoned.
So they meant to win there.
Or at least hold out indefinitely. Leonidas took a force of about 7,000 men, not just 300, but 7,000 Greeks, including the corps of Spartans. And he intended to hold that pass indefinitely. The strategic plan was to create a static front.
Just pin them in place?
Yes. By holding both the land pass and the sea straits, the Greeks hoped that the massive Persian army, unable to advance through the bottleneck and unable to be resupplied by their fleet because the straits were blocked, would simply consume their local supplies, run out of food, and be forced to withdraw back to Asia.
It was a blockade designed to starve the Persians out.
It was a sound, logistically driven strategy.
If they intended to hold the line, where did it fail? Why did it become a massacre?
It failed because of a critical intelligence gap. Leonidas did not know about the Anopeia path. This was a narrow, hidden mountain track that completely bypassed the main gate of Thermopylae. The Greek command only learned of its existence after they had already arrived and deployed their forces.
So they were flanked.
Yes. Once a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed this path to the Persians, Xerxes immediately sent his elite troops, the Immortals, up the mountain during the night to outflank the Greek position.
That is devastating.
It was. It was only on the final morning, when Leonidas realized his forces were entirely surrounded, that he dismissed the majority of the 7,000-man army to save them for future battles. He remained with the Spartans, the Thespians, and the Thebans to fight a desperate rearguard action to cover the retreat. It became a sacrifice out of sudden, catastrophic tactical necessity, not the original strategic design.
The blockade is broken. The Persians break through Thermopylae, they march south into Attica, and they actually capture and burn the city of Athens, achieving their retribution.
I got their vengeance.
But Themistocles manages to evacuate the Athenian populace, and he lures the Persian fleet into the narrow, treacherous straits of Salamis in September of 480 BCE. In those confined waters, the heavier, slower Greek navy manages to ram and destroy a significant portion of the Persian ships.
A decisive naval engagement.
Yeah, and Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shoreline, suddenly fears that he might be trapped in Europe. Without a massive fleet to supply his army or protect his pontoon bridges over the Hellespont, his troops will starve. So, he withdraws the bulk of his army back to Asia, leaving a substantial but more manageable force behind under the command of Mardonius to finish the conquest the following year.
Which brings us to the following year, 479 BCE. The allied Greek army, now fully mobilized, meets Mardonius's forces at the Battle of Plataea in Boeotia.
The final land showdown.
Right. Now, militarily, after a protracted and messy standoff, this ends in a decisive victory for the Greek hoplites. Mardonius is killed, and the Persian army is routed, effectively ending the second Persian invasion of mainland Greece. But what is truly significant about Plataea is not just the clash of spears. The real revolution happened behind the Greek lines.
You were talking about the logistics of feeding the Greek army. We always hear about how notoriously fractured and argumentative the Greek city-states were. They could barely agree on who should lead the army, let alone how to fund it.
It was always a political nightmare.
Right. So how did a coalition of fiercely independent, constantly bickering polis manage to supply a unified defense force large enough to defeat the Persian infantry?
That is the critical question that changes how we view Greek statecraft.
Yeah.
Historian Nicholas Secunda has done meticulous analytical work on the supply chain for the Greek army at Plataea, and he highlights a pivotal shift in military logistics.
How so?
Well, prior to this, Greek warfare was usually highly localized and brief. Armies fed themselves by living off the land, purchasing food from traveling camp followers, or requiring individual citizen soldiers to own their own rations for a few weeks.
Pack a lunch for the war.
Basically, yes. But at Plataea, for the first time in recorded Greek history, a massive combined army received systematic, daily supplies while encamped on the battlefield for weeks on end.
Moving that much grain and wine to a static camp of tens of thousands of men requires wagons, mules, drivers, and most importantly, it requires cash. You can't just steal from the local farmers for a month. There isn't enough food. They needed a centralized system to pay for massive bulk shipments.
Precisely. Secunda points out that the Greeks realized they could not rely on ad hoc foraging. They established a common treasury specifically for the Plataea campaign. Based on estimates of troop numbers and daily ration requirements for men and pack animals, Secunda calculates that the allied Greeks were spending roughly 10,000 drachmas a day just to keep the army fed and functioning in the field.
10,000 drachmas a day. That is an enormous, sustained economic hemorrhage for a coalition of small city-states that usually just fought quick border skirmishes.
It's staggering, and it placed a severe, unprecedented economic strain on the participating Greek polis. This raises a crucial point about the long-term, invisible impacts of this war. The immediate, terrifying necessity of fighting off the Persians forced the Greeks to innovate administratively.
They had to evolve to survive.
Exactly. The sheer need for a centralized treasury, coordinated taxation across multiple cities, and a unified wagon supply chain fundamentally altered how these independent cities interacted. They were forced, under extreme duress, to build bureaucratic machinery that had never existed before in the Hellenic world. They were learning how to act, tax, and spend as a single coordinated state entity.
And they were learning how to utilize their geography to their advantage on a massive scale, not just in terms of wagon routes to Plataea, but throughout the conflict. You mentioned Salamis earlier, where the crucial naval victory occurred. There is some interesting recent evidence that shows just how intentional and engineered that geographic strategy was.
Yes, the 2023 underwater excavations at Salamis. For a long time, we relied solely on textual descriptions of the battle. But archaeologists recently uncovered ancient seawalls and the remains of a submerged public building right in the harbor where the engagement took place.
What does finding a sunken wall tell us about the battle?
It provides physical confirmation of our understanding of the site's strategic layout. It proves that the Greeks were highly aware of the coastal geography and actively modified it.
So they didn't just stumble into a good spot.
No, By utilizing these constructed seawalls and the natural narrow straits, the Greeks intentionally constrained the movements of the much larger, perhaps less maneuverable Persian fleet. They were mitigating Persian numerical superiority through intense geographic and architectural manipulation. It wasn't just a lucky fight in a narrow channel. It was a planned engagement in an engineered battle space.
So they survive. They push the Persian land army out of mainland Greece at Plataea, and almost simultaneously, the Greek fleet sails across the Aegean and defeats the remnants of the Persian navy at a battle called Mycale, right on the coast of Ionia.
The immediate existential threat of invasion is gone.
But that newly built administrative machinery, that common treasury, the habit of coordinating vast fleets, it doesn't just disappear. You don't build an unprecedented, centralized, multi-state war machine and just dismantle it overnight. The Greeks, specifically the Athenians, realized they had a massively profitable apparatus on their hands, which leads us to how the defenders morphed into an empire.
Following the definitive victories of 479 BCE, the political landscape of Greece fractured again. Sparta, which had traditionally led the Greek alliances due to its elite land army, decided to withdraw from further naval campaigns across the Aegean.
They were done fighting abroad.
The Spartan high command felt the primary objective, defending the Peloponnese and the mainland, was achieved. Furthermore, they had severe domestic issues to manage, primarily the constant threat of unrest from the Helots, their massive enslaved population. Sparta turns inward,
Leaving a huge void.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This creates a massive power vacuum in the Aegean, and Athens, flush with naval confidence, eagerly fills it.
In 477 BCE, Athens calls a massive congress of various Greek city-states. These are mostly coastal cities and island communities from the Aegean and the newly liberated Ionian coast. They meet on the island of Delos, which is a holy sanctuary to Apollo, and crucially, neutral ground.
A safe space for diplomacy.
Yeah. They form a new, formalized alliance with a stated purpose: to continue the war against Persia, to liberate any remaining Greek cities under Persian rule, and to exact revenge and plunder from the great king's territories. And there is this highly symbolic theatrical moment during the swearing of the oaths for this alliance. The representatives of the member states literally take heavy iron ingots and drop them into the sea.
Swearing a solemn oath that the alliance will remain binding until the iron floats to the surface.
Which is obviously never.
It is meant to be a permanent, unbreakable pact. This organization becomes known to us as the Delian League. But administering a permanent, multi-state naval alliance is incredibly complex. The Athenian statesman Aristides, who had a reputation for absolute fairness, was tasked with assessing the contributions required from each member state.
How did that work in practice?
The system was designed so that members could either provide fully equipped triremes and trained crews, or, if they couldn't manage that, they could pay a direct monetary tax, known as phoros, into a joint treasury kept secure on the island of Delos.
Now, a trireme is essentially the ancient equivalent of a fighter jet. It is wildly expensive to build, it requires constant maintenance, and it needs 200 men to operate it. Most of the smaller island states look at the math and realize they cannot afford to maintain warships. So they opt to just pay the phoros. They write a check to Athens and say, you build the ships, you fight the Persians, we'll fund it. How much money is flowing into this treasury?
The initial assessment by Aristides totaled approximately 460 talents of silver annually. This was a colossal, unprecedented sum of hard currency flowing into a central treasury every single year.
I want to pause here because this is where the history gets deeply ironic. Think about the entire premise of the Greek resistance. The whole thing started with the Ionian Revolt, which was explicitly a rebellion to throw off the yoke of Persian taxation and the burden of funding someone else's military.
It is a profound, almost tragic historical irony. The Athenians effectively took over the exact fiscal organization and regional tribute system that the Persian satrap Artaphernes had established for the Ionian cities decades earlier.
They became what they hated.
The Greeks literally adopted the Persian administrative model of taxation to fight the Persians. Athens simply replaced Susa as the collector of the phoros.
It is like a neighborhood watch that slowly morphs into a mafia protection racket. You start as a mutual defense pact, everybody chipping in for security. But very quickly, when one party, Athens, holds all the ships, commands all the military operations, and controls the flow of all that silver, the dynamic fundamentally shifts.
A power imbalance becomes too great.
Great. The dues become mandatory tribute. And if you try to leave the neighborhood watch, Athens will use the fleet you paid for to sail to your island, tear down your walls, and burn your crops until you pay up. Athens starts using the League's fleet not just to fight Persia, but to force member states to stay in the League and to violently compel neutral cities to join and pay tribute.
The creation of this naval hegemon also caused massive political fallout within Athens itself. We have to look at the mechanics of the fleet. The maintenance and operation of a massive, permanent navy of hundreds of triremes required thousands upon thousands of rowers.
That's a huge workforce.
And these rowers could not just be the wealthy elites who traditionally fought as hoplites. The manpower demands meant the rowers had to come primarily from the thetes, the lowest, poorest property class of Athenian citizens.
This is a crucial point of how technology changes politics. In ancient Athens, your political power was historically tied to your military contribution. The rich guys bought bronze armor, stood in the phalanx, and therefore dictated policy. But suddenly, the survival and the immense wealth of the entire Athenian state depends on the sweat of the poorest citizens pulling oars in the galleys.
They hold the state together now.
You cannot ask a man to row for his life, to project your imperial power across the sea, and then tell him he has no voice in the assembly.
Exactly. The physical mechanics of the trireme fleet demanded the radicalization of democracy. Because the labor of the thetes was now the foundation of the state's power, their political leverage increased dramatically. The Delian League's naval dominance, funded by allied tribute, directly financed and empowered the radical expansion of Athenian democracy during the 5th century. The poorest citizens voted for aggressive expansion because imperial expansion meant steady paychecks for rowing.
But the facade that this was just an alliance of equals eventually drops entirely. When does Athens stop pretending?
The mask slips in the 460s BCE. Athens, feeling incredibly confident, leads a massive League expedition to support a local revolt in Egypt against the Persian king Artaxerxes I. They saw an opportunity to secure Egyptian grain and deal a massive blow to Persian prestige.
It's like a massive overreach.
It was. This campaign drags on for years and ends in a catastrophic total defeat for the Greeks around 454 BCE. An entire fleet and a massive army are wiped out in the Nile Delta.
It's a disaster, and Athens uses this disaster as an excuse to consolidate power.
Precisely. Citing the sudden vulnerability of the Aegean to a potential Persian naval counterattack after the Egyptian disaster, Athens declares that the treasury on Delos is no longer safe. In 454 BCE, they physically moved the massive accumulated treasury of the League from the neutral island of Delos to the Acropolis in the heart of Athens.
They move the vault into their own house, and once the money is on the Acropolis, they start using that allied tribute for their own civic projects, like funding the construction of the Parthenon.
Moving the treasury in 454 BCE cemented their transition. It was no longer a league of allies paying for mutual defense. It was explicitly the Athenian Empire extracting wealth from subjects.
So, Athens is building a golden age and a radical democracy on the back of a Persian-style extortion racket, all while ostensibly still fighting a war against the Achaemenid Empire. But that open warfare eventually grinds to a halt. The battles stop. This brings us to the Peace of Callias and the Persian economic calculus, around 449 BCE. We need to shift our perspective back to the Achaemenid court in Susa. Why did Persia finally stop the direct military confrontations in the Aegean? Was it a total admission of defeat by the great king, or was something far more calculating going on?
Well, the traditional narrative, which is heavily derived from later Greek orators and patriotic speeches, suggests that Persia was simply bled dry. The story goes that they were too exhausted, militarily depleted, and terrified of the Athenian navy to continue fighting, and that Artaxerxes I was forced to sign a humiliating treaty known as the Peace of Callias, negotiated by an Athenian envoy named Callias.
If you read the supposed terms of this peace, it sounds like an absolute crushing victory for Athens. The terms generally state that the Greek cities in Asia Minor are to be granted autonomy and live under their own laws. Furthermore, Persian satraps and their royal land armies are forbidden from coming within a 3-day journey of the Aegean coast. And finally, Persian warships are entirely banned from sailing into the Aegean Sea. Athens basically slaps a restraining order on the largest empire in the world.
That is the Greek interpretation. But we are looking deeper into the mechanics of the empire. When you analyze the economic realities of the Achaemenid state, the idea that this was a desperate surrender completely falls apart. This is where the thesis of modern historian Fons Koopmans is highly illuminating. Koopmans argues that viewing the cessation of hostilities merely as an admission of Persian weakness is a fundamental misreading of imperial strategy.
So what was really driving the decision?
He posits that Artaxerxes made a highly pragmatic, calculated economic decision to cut his losses and reorganize his budget.
Okay, let's walk through that cost-benefit analysis. What does Artaxerxes actually lose on paper, and what does he gain by signing this treaty?
Let's start with the losses. By agreeing to leave the Ionian cities autonomous and withdrawing his tax collectors from the coast, the Persian Empire officially lost the tribute from those western Anatolian regions. Koopmans, utilizing the Athenian tribute lists as a proxy for the wealth of the region, estimates this loss at roughly 140 to 168 Attic talents annually. If you include some of the offshore islands and cities near the Hellespont, the loss might have reached up to 300 talents a year.
That is a highly significant sum of silver.
It is. It means peace required a genuine, painful economic sacrifice from the imperial treasury.
So the Persians are taking a hit to revenue. But what is on the other side of the ledger? Why is giving up 300 talents a smart move?
Because the savings were absolutely astronomical. We established earlier how expensive a trireme is. Maintaining a massive, constantly active royal naval fleet capable of challenging the Athenian Empire and the Aegean was exorbitantly expensive. You have to build the ships, constantly replace the ones that rot, source massive amounts of timber from distant mountainous regions, and pay daily wages to thousands upon thousands of rowers and marines.
It's just a black hole for money.
Exactly. It was a massive drain on the treasury. Koopmans points to a very telling statistic. Decades later, during a subsequent regional crisis, the Athenian commander Pericles only needed a fleet of 60 triremes to patrol and secure the entire eastern Aegean.
Which proves that the Persian naval threat was completely gone.
Precisely. The fact that Athens only needed 60 ships proves that Persia had massively downsized its own navy. By agreeing to keep their ships out of the Aegean, Artaxerxes eliminated the need to fund a standing Western fleet. He eliminated a massive compounding drain on the imperial budget. The vast sums of money saved by decommissioning the navy far outweighed the loss of the Ionian coastal tribute.
So it isn't a surrender. It is a brutal corporate budget cut. The great king looks at the spreadsheet, realizes the return on investment for fighting a naval war in the Aegean is massively negative, and decides to liquidate the department.
And there's a secondary economic benefit to stopping the war too, right?
Yes, a massive one. The cessation of constant naval warfare and piracy allowed maritime trade to absolutely boom across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. While the Persian state lost the direct tax revenue from Ionian cities, Persia's western satrapies, the inland regions that were still firmly under royal control, benefited immensely from this increased commercial activity. Goods were flowing safely again. This generated massive alternative streams of revenue through regional tolls, tariffs on trade routes, and general economic prosperity that helped offset the lost tribute. That makes perfect economic sense. It's a rational policy. But here's the problem. Achaemenid great kings don't run on pure economics. They run on ideology. They claim universal supremacy mandated by God. How on earth did Artaxerxes spin, giving up territory, retreating from the sea, and signing a treaty with a lesser state as a victory back home? If you were the king of kings, you can't just tell your nobles you shrank the empire to save money.
This is where we return to the Achaemenid ideology of Draga and cosmic order we discussed at the very beginning. Artaxerxes did not frame the peace as a loss, a surrender, or even a compromise. He framed it as an imposition of imperial order.
How does that PR spin work?
Remember the mechanics of the treaty negotiation. The Athenians sent an embassy, led by Callias, all the way to the Persian court in Susa to negotiate the terms. In the Persian ideological framework, the great king does not travel to negotiate. He summons his enemies, and they obey by coming to him. The very act of the Greek embassy arriving at the royal court, standing before the throne, and asking for a cessation of hostilities was viewed and officially recorded as an act of submission.
If you've ever watched a modern politician spin an absolute disaster into a resounding victory on the evening news, you are watching the exact same PR playbook Artaxerxes used in 449 BCE. Just showing up to the negotiating table was legally interpreted as bowing down.
Precisely. And we see this ideological spin manifested physically in the royal architecture. Look at the reliefs carved into the palaces at Persepolis. The imperial iconography commissioned by Artaxerxes depicts endless lines of foreign delegations, explicitly including Greeks, walking among the king's subjects, bringing gifts and tribute. Furthermore, in the ancient Near Eastern royal tradition, granting land, autonomy, or forgiveness to former enemies who had submitted was a classic display of royal benevolence and overwhelming strength. By officially granting the Ionian cities their autonomy, Artaxerxes was acting out the role of the supreme, generous monarch, bestowing a gift upon a lesser people, not a defeated general ceding territory.
So they basically rewrote the reality of the treaty.
In the Persian mind, the chaos of the Greek rebellion had finally been pacified, and order had been restored to the frontier.
It is a brilliant face-saving spin. Athens goes home, builds the Parthenon, and tells themselves they won the war and dictated terms to the king. Artaxerxes sits in his palace, counts his massive budget savings, and carves monuments about how the Greeks finally learned their place. And this economic and diplomatic pivot sets up the final act of this conflict perfectly. We move into the endgame. If direct military confrontation is too expensive and bad for the budget, how does the Achaemenid Empire eventually reassert actual control over the Greeks?
You do it through gold and diplomacy. The Persians realized they didn't need to fight the Greeks. They just needed to let the Greeks fight each other. And the perfect opportunity presented itself when the fragile balance of power in Greece violently shattered. In 431 BCE, the Peloponnesian War breaks out. This is a massive, devastating, decades-long conflict between the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League, which is led by Sparta.
The two great powers that had previously united to fight off Xerxes are now locked in a death struggle, trying to completely destroy each other, and Persia sees an opening.
They absolutely do. The Persian satraps in Asia Minor recognize that a protracted Greek civil war perfectly serves imperial interests. As long as Athens and Sparta are killing each other, they aren't raiding Persian territory. So the Persians begin to intervene. But they don't send armies. They intervene financially. Persia begins providing massive subsidies of gold and silver to the Spartans.
Just bankrolling the enemy of their enemy.
We are talking about sums estimated at over 5,000 talents injected into the Spartan war effort over the course of the conflict. The Persians provide the immense capital that allows Sparta, a land-based power, to build and maintain a fleet capable of challenging the dominant Athenian navy.
But the Persians are smart. They don't just hand the Spartans a blank check, wish them luck, and walk away. There is a very specific, highly debated strategy at play here, particularly associated with a Persian satrap named Tissaphernes.
Tissaphernes is one of the most fascinating diplomatic figures of the era. The Greek historian Thucydides, who lived through this war, claims that Tissaphernes was executing a highly intentional, cynical strategy. According to Thucydides, Tissaphernes' goal was to intentionally wear out the resources of all the Hellenes by equalizing them.
Keep the scales balanced.
Right. He would provide just enough financial support to Sparta to keep their fleet afloat and keep them in the fight. But he would intentionally delay payments, reduce wages, or withhold naval reinforcements so that Sparta could never quite land a final knockout blow against Athens. Thucydides views this as a brilliant diplomatic balancing act designed to let the Greeks bleed each other entirely dry.
I have to push back on the modern pushback here. Thucydides was practically a contemporary. He interviewed the people involved. Isn't it a bit arrogant for modern scholars, looking at a few scattered treasury records thousands of years later, to assume the Persians were just dealing with budget cuts, rather than executing the highly calculated, cynical strategy that Thucydides described?
It is a valid challenge, and there is significant debate in the academic community. Historians like Fons Koopmans and John Hyland evaluate the surviving economic data and suggest a reality that is less about grand, cynical strategy and more about bureaucratic friction. They argue that Tissaphernes may not have been a puppet master executing a grand balancing act. Instead, he was a regional governor managing severe economic constraints.
How so?
While the Peloponnesian War went on for nearly 30 years, subsidizing a massive Spartan fleet year after year drained the local satrapal treasuries in Asia Minor. When Tissaphernes lowered the wages paid to the Spartan sailors or delayed fleet deployments, it was likely because he was literally running out of allocated funds.
So the check bounced, basically.
The great king, Darius II at this point, was sitting in Susa, looking at the ledgers, and becoming increasingly reluctant to send more royal treasure for a proxy war that wasn't producing quick, decisive results. So, when Tissaphernes cuts funding, it might not have been a grand move of balancing powers. It might have just been a satrap dealing with imperial budget cuts and telling the Spartans, sorry, funds are tight this quarter, you'll have to make do.
It's a difference between a master manipulator and a middle manager whose budget just got slashed. But ultimately, regardless of whether it was intentional brilliance or bureaucratic necessity, the result was exactly the same. The Greek city-states completely exhausted themselves in a nearly 30-year meat grinder. Sparta eventually wins the war in 404 BCE, utterly dismantling the Athenian Empire. But to achieve that victory, Sparta is now entirely reliant on Persian goodwill and Persian funding to maintain their new fragile hegemony over Greece.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of this entire narrative. The year is 387 or 386 BCE. We are over a century removed from the burning of Sardis and the start of this conflict. The current Persian monarch is Artaxerxes II, and he decides it is finally time to collect on the long game.
Set the scene in Greece. Sparta won the big war, but they couldn't hold the peace.
Exactly. Sparta's harsh, arrogant rule alienated everyone. They had become entangled in yet another exhausting conflict, the Corinthian War, facing a new coalition of Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos. The Greeks are trapped in a cycle of endless destructive warfare. Exhausted, bankrupt, and unable to secure a decisive military victory, the Spartans sent an envoy named Antichetus all the way to the Persian court to beg the great king to intervene and impose a peace settlement.
Stop and think about the sheer irony of that moment. A century earlier, the Greeks united to fight off the Persian king to maintain their freedom. Now, completely broken by their own infighting, the leading state of Greece goes to the Persian king and begs him to fix their domestic politics. And what does Artaxerxes II do when they ask for his help?
He dictates the terms of what becomes known as the King's Peace, or the Peace of Antichetus. And the terms are staggering when you consider the history of the previous century. Artaxerxes demands and receives the complete return of the Greek cities of Asia Minor, the Ionian cities that started the original revolt, and several key islands directly back into Persian control. He reclaims the territory his ancestors lost.
He just takes Ionia back with a stroke of a pen.
He does. Furthermore, he decrees that all other Greek cities, big or small, must remain completely autonomous and independent. This seemingly fair rule was actually a mechanism to permanently shatter Greek power. By forcing autonomy, he legally dissolved the power blocks and empires of Athens, Thebes, and Corinth, ensuring they could never unite against Persia again.
And what was the enforcement mechanism? If Athens decided to rebuild its empire, who stops them?
The Persian king declared that he would make war, using his own royal ships and vast treasury, on any Greek state that did not accept and maintain these terms. He made Sparta the enforcer of the king's will on the Greek mainland, backed by Persian gold.
What an absolute complete reversal of fortune. So when we step back and look at the entirety of the Greco-Persian Wars, what does this all mean? How do we redefine who actually won?
It forces us to redefine the concept of victory. The Greeks undoubtedly won the famous cinematic battles of the 5th century Marathon, Salamis, Plataea. They successfully defended their homeland from direct military annexation. That is a massive achievement. But a century later, a Persian king sat in his capital and dictated the fundamental terms of existence to all of Greece. He reclaimed the Ionian territories that had sparked the whole conflict.
And neutered the rest of the states.
He reduced the major, once proud Greek poleis to the status of squabbling, dependent client states. And he achieved this absolute geopolitical dominance without risking a single Persian army on the European mainland. It was a masterclass in economic endurance, diplomatic manipulation, and imperial patience. The Greeks won the battles, but the Persians won the era.
The endurance of the Achaemenid administrative state is the truly defining feature here. They lost fleets, they lost armies, they lost face. But their system, their immense bureaucratic ability to generate wealth, to manage diverse populations, to adapt their strategies from brute force to economic warfare over decades, allowed them to simply outlast the Greek experiment.
That administrative resilience is the real legacy of the Achaemenid Empire.
Which leaves us with this final thought to consider. Our modern understanding of this entire era, the grand, sweeping narrative of West versus East, the romantic ideal of freedom versus tyranny, the story of small democratic bands holding out against endless hordes, was largely birthed from this specific conflict. But that narrative was heavily curated by Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, who were writing to celebrate Greek identity. Think about the massive archives of administrative records, the detailed satrapal reports, the royal diaries of the Achaemenid Empire that were lost to time or physically destroyed when Alexander the Great later burned Persepolis. If the meticulous Persian accounts of these events had survived the fires of history just as well as the Greek plays and histories did, how entirely different would our understanding of the villain and the hero be today? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.